This is the story of the 1980 riot at the Penitentiary of New Mexico. Shortly before 2 a.m. on Saturday, February 2nd, 1980, inmates at the Penitentiary of New Mexico near Santa Fe overpowered 4 correctional officers during a routine inspection in a medium security dormitory. The inmates then rushed through the open dormitory door and within minutes captured 4 more officers. Then, using keys taken from the officers, inmates freed fellow prisoners of the Southwest Wing, then moved through an open drill gate to the administrative area of the institution, smashing their way into the main control center. With the seizure of the control center, the inmates gained access to every part of the main penitentiary building, where 1,157 male inmates lived under the custody and care of 25 correctional employees. In the 36 hours that followed, 12 officers were held hostage, some of them beaten, stabbed, and sodomized. Tragically, 33 inmates died at the hands of their fellow prisoners, with some of the victims being tortured and their bodies mutilated. At least 90 other inmates were seriously injured in the riot, suffering from drug overdoses or from beatings, stabbings, and rape. By the time the riots were over, most of the inmates had escaped to the outer wall. Prison officials communicated with inmates throughout the weekend in an effort to negotiate the release of the officers being held hostage and the surrender of the inmates. The incident started to unfold on Friday, February 1st at around 8:30 p.m. when a group of inmates began drinking the large amount of homebrew they made. Fast forward to 10:30 p.m. and they're all drunk and angry and talking loudly about taking over the place. The men finally agreed that 2 of them would position themselves in the 2 single beds nearest to the door and attack it when the officers opened it for the closing of the day room. Inmates who witnessed the riot unfold said, "We all agreed if the guards didn't shut the door behind them, we're taking it over." At about 1:30 a.m. February 2nd, Captain Roybal and Officers Schmidt and Martinez prepared to close the day room in dormitory E2. Schmidt gave Martinez his keys, Roybal already didn't have any, and Martinez unlocked and opened the door. After opening the door and stepping back, Roybal and Schmidt entered, with Roybal going down the right aisle and Schmidt the left. It is uncertain whether Officer Martinez locked the unit door after the 2 officers entered, but inmates said he didn't. Then Lieutenant Anaya entered the unit shortly after Schmidt and Roybal, and when the officers entered, the 2 inmates who attacked the door were already in the 2 beds 5 feet from the door. They waited until Roybal was over halfway down the right aisle, Schmidt was in the day room, and Anaya was 4 or 5 bunks into the dormitory, and that's when one inmate leaped from the bed and hit the still open door. His partner followed and attempted to knock the door wide open, as other inmates quickly joined in. Roybal, Schmidt, and Anaya were jumped at the same time, Roybal as he was standing in the right aisle, and Schmidt just after he heard the attack. They were quickly overpowered, and with Martinez struggling to force the door shut, the inmates broke through. You see, Roybal and Anaya are both short, middle-aged men of only average physical fitness for their age. The inmates, on the other hand, were not only much younger and quicker, but many of them lifted weights daily. Only Schmidt had both youth and size to offer a challenge, and he, like the others, was simply overwhelmed by numbers. He was taken to the day room where he managed to throw his own car keys and the day room keys out the window. All 4 officers, Martinez, Roybal, Anaya, and Schmidt, were then stripped, bound, and blindfolded. An inmate dressed in Roybal's uniform then led other inmates down the stairs between E2 and E1 and through the unlocked gate at the bottom of the stairs. They then ran out the vestibule through the open, unused riot-controlled grill and ran north along the corridor and then up the stairs to dormitory F2. There they attacked Officer Curry, Bustos, Victor Gallegos, and Herman Gallegos, who had just secured dormitory A2 and was outside F2 preparing to secure it. Curry offered resistance, but the inmates stabbed, beat, and finally subdued him. They took Curry and Victor Gallegos to the E2 day room and held them with the other hostages. In the confusion of the attack, Herman Gallegos ran into the day room of F2, where he was protected by sympathetic inmates. 8 guards were now held hostage. Some inmates then took the keys from the guards and unlocked the doors to other dormitories to release other inmates, and almost immediately at least 125 inmates were free in the main corridor in the south wing, and within minutes more than 500 had access to the corridor from dorms A1, A2, F1, F2, B1, B2, and E2. The inmates in E1, a semi-protective custody dormitory, barricaded themselves in their unit. Other inmates stripped, bound, and blindfolded Bustos in the day room, and then dragged him downstairs to the main corridor by a belt looped around his neck. The crowd of inmates now roaming the corridor began to push and kick him northward down the hallway towards the control center. At approximately 1:57 a.m., Officer Lucero was manning the control center when he heard an inmate's voice on the two-way radio saying the shift captain had been taken hostage. The voice demanded a meeting with the governor, representatives of the news media, and Deputy Corrections Secretary Felix Rodriguez. Within moments, Lucero received a telephone call from Officer Mike Hernandez in D1 saying inmates were on the loose on the south side. Hernandez had locked himself in the educational wing, delaying his eventual capture. Lucero telephoned North Wing Officer Valentine Martinez and told him to close and lock the far north corridor grill. Then at approximately 2 a.m., he called the Superintendent of Correctional Security, Manuel Coronios, and informed him that a riot was developing. Coronios immediately called Deputy Warden Robert Montoya, who in turn alerted Warden Jerry Griffin. Correctionals Officer Larry Mendoza and Antonio Vigil were in the officers' mess hall shortly before 2 a.m. Mendoza had just finished his morning meal, and Vigil was just beginning to eat when they heard a disturbance in the south wing. From the door of the mess hall, the officers observed a group of inmates kicking a naked man in the corridor near dormitories A and F. Mendoza saw that the south corridor grill, which was about midway between the mess hall and the inmates, was open. He determined that there was insufficient time in which to secure the grill before the inmates reached it. Vigil and Mendoza ran north up the corridor and pounded on the control center window, telling Officer Lawrence Lucero to unlock the north corridor grill. Lucero unlocked the grill electronically, and they ran through and then locked themselves in the north wing. Vigil remained in the corridor behind the grill and observed the inmates while Mendoza went to cell block 3 and telephoned the residence of Manuel Coronios, which was located on the penitentiary reservation. It was at that point that he learned Coronios had already been alerted and was en route to the prison. Mendoza then telephoned Officer Hotch in Tower 1 and told him to alert the other tower officers of a riot in progress and to instruct them to shoot anyone attempting to escape. From inside the control center, Lucero and C. De Baca could see a group of 75 to 100 inmates gathering in front of the glass windows in the main corridor. One of the inmates in the front of the crowd demanded that Lucero open the grills adjacent to the control center, allowing the inmates access to the front offices of the institution. Lucero refused, and the inmates began to beat the naked hostage, Bustos, with steel rods and pipes, telling the control center officer he could expect the same treatment if he did not cooperate. Bustos, whom Lucero did not recognize, was knocked unconscious, and Lucero thought he had been killed. The inmates dragged the hostage southward down the corridor and began to beat on the control center window with pipes and a fire extinguisher. Officer Mendoza and Vigil watched from behind the north corridor grill some 15 feet away and saw that the fire extinguisher just bounced off the glass, so they figured they were safe. They heaved the fire extinguisher against the window a second time, and it just bounced off again. On the third throw, however, the window began cracking, and only seconds later, inmates were in the control center. Their break-in took a total of 3 to 5 minutes. Believing the windows would not break, Lucero and C. De Baca stood in the control center and watched the assault on the glass. Although when bits of glass began falling, they knew the glass wouldn't hold, so fearing imminent capture, the two fled. But unfortunately, in their haste to escape, the officers did not secure any keys on the keyboard or attempt to use the tear gas stored in the control center. They were the first two correctional officers to escape the riot. In 22 minutes, the inmates had gained control of the institution. In the north wing, Mendoza had returned from the telephone to the main corridor, where he saw the group of inmates breaking into the control center. Fearing they would soon gain access to the north wing, Mendoza returned to cell block 3 and again called Tower 1. He spoke with Coronios, who had arrived at the front entrance, telling him the control center had been seized, and that if help did not arrive within minutes, the institution would be within the complete control of the inmates. To which Coronios replied, "We're doing all we can." As it became apparent to North Wing officers that the rioting inmates had seized the control center, they began to seek refuge. Vigil telephoned Richards in Tower 3 and informed him that he and Valentine Martinez would be hiding in the basement crawl space near the gas chamber. He then told Richards not to transmit their hiding place over the radio for fear that the inmates would hear it. So Richards relayed the information by throwing a note to state police officers standing near the fence. The police then gave the note to Warden Griffin. Infirmary technician Ross Mays locked himself into the upstairs hospital with 7 inmate patients. Officer Mendoza, Gutierrez, and Ortega locked themselves in the basement area of cell block 3. That's when Mendoza realized he had left the main key to the cell block in the security box located in the vestibule. He crawled to the box, which is used to transfer keys from the main entrance to the security cage on the 3rd tier, and retrieved the key. Although Mendoza was not detected by inmates, he was able to watch a number of inmates in the corridor, and that's when he said, "That's when I began to get very frightened." Mendoza returned to the basement of cell block 3, where he, Ortega, and Gutierrez locked themselves in the area used to store bedding. Having broken into the control center and electronically unlocked the corridor grill to the north wing, the inmates rushed through the main corridor towards cell block 3. Some inmates fumbled through a bunch of keys which had been brought from the control center, but in their haste they apparently didn't pay attention to the markings on the keyboard which identified the keys to various units. Officer Mendoza, who had returned to the main floor, was ordered to unlock the unit where he'd be killed. He refused and returned to the basement, and between 2:15 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., the inmates moved Captain Roybal from the E2 day room to cell block 3. The inmates then attempted to persuade the cell block 3 officers in the basement to open the unit by threatening the captain's life, but in accordance with prison policy, the officers still refused. Unfortunately though, the inmates eventually found the right key to unlock the unit grill. The officers still refused to open the grill to the basement and even tried using the double deadlock, but it didn't work. The inmates finally found the appropriate key and unlocked the basement grill, as well as the individual cells. That's when the officers ran behind another grill and refused to open it, even though Captain Roybal was being threatened. This refusal to open the grill was again consistent with the prison riot policy. Mendoza, Ortega, and Gutierrez surrendered to the inmates when they came through the final grill with the keys. 11 guards are now held hostage. The inmates then ordered the guards to strip naked and told them to remain in the locked basement area. The inmates had already begun to release the residents of cell block 3. Entry to the 2 upper tiers of the cell block was controlled by a panel which proved difficult for the inmates to operate, so they forced Captain Roybal to assist with the release of cell block 3 inmates by demonstrating the operation of the control mechanism. Roybal was then locked in a cell in cell block 3, and by 3 a.m. most of the residents in cell block 3 were free. Inmates would also break into the hospital and pharmacy, raiding all the drugs. They would also find an acetylene cutting torch, which was being stored in the plumbing shop, and they would use this torch to cut through the manually operated corridor grill, separating the educational wing and dormitory D1. Officer Michael Hernandez, who had locked himself in the unit, was taken hostage, which brought the number of total hostages to 12. Next, the inmates would set their sight on cell block 4, which was the protective custody unit. Therefore, any inmate housed in cell block 4 was labeled by most other inmates as snitches. Whether or not that inmate actually was, didn't matter. Inmates associated with the snitch game were risking danger. You see, what they call the snitch game is where guards would threaten to tell inmates that they're a snitch if they don't tell them what they want to know. Or, in other words, it was a form of blackmail. And that brings us to 5:25 a.m. when Officer Herman Gallegos became the first hostage to escape. Aided by sympathetic inmates, he managed to sneak undetected past rioting convicts out of Dormitory F and escaped through the main entrance. Gallegos proceeded towards the front gate near Tower 1 about the same time an injured inmate, Ray Vallejos, was being taken out on a stretcher. The officer rushed through the gate ahead of pursuing inmates. Then at 7:02 a.m., just before dawn, some inmates dragged Officer Elton Curry, who had been stabbed, beaten, and kicked, out of the main entrance on a mattress. He was turned over to authorities for medical attention. It was the first deliberate release of a hostage. Officials speculated that inmates released him because they didn't want him to die. Only 5 minutes later at 7:07 a.m., inmates informed Montoya that Officer Hernandez was injured and in need of medical attention. After more than an hour of radio negotiations, they carried Hernandez outside and turned him over to medics at 8:20 a.m. 9 hostages remain inside. Just after dawn, rampaging inmates shouting "Kill the snitches" finally cut through the cell block 4 grill with an acetylene torch and gained access to the protective custody inmates. Those cutting into the cell block shouted the names of their intended victims waiting inside. When individual cells were opened, some of the cell block 4 residents masked themselves with strips of torn blankets and were able to hide their identity and survive. Groups of violent inmates, described later as execution squads, went from cell to cell in the protection unit, designating their victims while waiting for a cutting crew to torch open the panel. Some impatient killers threw flammable liquids into locked cells and onto inmates marked for destruction, and then lit it on fire. When the cells were open, the rampaging inmates dragged many of their cell block 4 victims out and stabbed, tortured, bludgeoned, burned, hanged, and hacked them apart. Victims were thrown from upstairs tiers to the basement floor, where many of the bodies were found. Around 3 a.m. Saturday, inmates and hostages could hear pleas of "No era yo, it wasn't me," and "No lo he's, I didn't do it," coming from a cell in the basement level of cell block 3. The man shouting the denials, Archie Martinez, was probably the first to die in the riot. And people who wasn't even a snitch like Paulina Paul was also killed. There was also 3 employees that managed to stay hidden throughout the entire 36-hour ordeal. Governor King arrived to the headquarters at 8:30 a.m. while the convicts were still on the line and agreed to talk with them. The inmates said the riot was initiated just to get somebody's attention and complained of being treated like a bunch of kids. The rioters then attempted to force the residents out of Dormitory E1, the semi-protective unit, by setting fires and throwing tear gas into the unit. The residents fanned the smoke and gas back into the corridor, turning back the attackers. They then used a 3-foot-long wrench to bust out a barred window and escape around 7 a.m., surrendering to officers. Surrendering inmates were describing a scene of murder and torture inside the prison. At 9:12 a.m., Deputy Warden Montoya and Deputy Secretary Rodriguez entered into a face-to-face parley with inmate Don Stout and one other prisoner midway between the gatehouse and the main entrance. Governor King would arrive at the prison at 9:15 a.m. The convict negotiators actually requested firefighting equipment and for crews to be sent into the prison to fight the smoke and flames. Although when firefighters actually went inside at 11:30 a.m., inmates threw stuff at them and pushed them back. The damage and killing was done by relatively few inmates. Most inmates tried only to escape the chaos, while some worked to rescue other inmates and some protected guards held hostage. Wounded convicts and those overdosed on drugs were carried out into the yard by their fellow inmates. While some inmates manned the stretchers as a way to escape the building, others, like a man nicknamed Doc, returned each time, repeatedly dressing the wounds of prisoners and guards alike. At 7:12 p.m., 10 hours after the governor had promised a press meeting with inmates, inmates Stout and Price met face-to-face with Santa Fe radio commentator Ernie Mills and Albuquerque television reporter John Andrews at the Tower 1 gate. Senator Manny Aragon had also begun talking with inmates independent of corrections officials. The inmates asked that a television camera be brought in, and Mills promised that a camera would be brought in the next day. As a result of the conversation with reporters, Lieutenant Anaya, who had been reported in poor condition, was released on a stretcher at 8:22 p.m. 8 hostages were left inside. Fast forward a few hours later, around 10:45 p.m., and inmates Stout and Flores enter a face-to-face dialogue with Montoya, Rodriguez, and Mills. As a result of this conversation, and in anticipation of getting a cameraman inside the prison, Bustos, who had been beaten just moments before during the conversation between negotiators and inmates, was released bound to a chair at 11:23 p.m. 7 hostages remained inside. Around midnight, an NBC cameraman from Los Angeles, Michael Shagru, was at the gatehouse with a video recorder and camera from the network's Albuquerque affiliate, KOB-TV. Michael had been told that a news conference was being arranged and that he had been brought in to take part. He said, "I thought they were going to set up a table and we would all go out there and shoot the news conference, but none of the other TV crews ever showed up, so it fell through. Some of the inmates asked me if I would go inside and tape them, and I said I would go in only on the condition that it was cleared through the prison officials. I asked Montoya and he told me, if you want to go in, go ahead." At 12:07 a.m., some inmates carried Officer Schmidt out on a stretcher and dragged him to the Tower 1 gate. They then dragged him back towards the prison and would not release him until Michael walked inside the prison yard. When Michael walked inside the compound, they released Officer Schmidt. 6 hostages remain inside. Michael then entered the prison and spent about 40 minutes inside talking with and videotaping inmates in the visitor's room of the administrative area. Some of the inmates wore masks during the interview, others showed their faces and gave their names to the reporter, and they complained of the poor food, harassment by correctional staff, overcrowding, and the lack of recreation. Michael was escorted out of the prison without incident shortly before 1 a.m. He said, "I was never threatened, I never saw a gun or knife, although there were a lot of clubs. If I had known then what was going on back there, I would have never gone in." At 1:07 a.m. Sunday, an inmate radioed saying, "Attention all units, we're going to hold off till tomorrow morning." That Sunday morning at 7:53 a.m., Corrections Officer Victor Gallegos, an ex-Marine who had only been working there for 3 weeks when the riot broke out, managed to sneak out of the institution. He was assisted by sympathetic inmates who had dressed him in convict clothes and hid him under a bunk in a cell for several hours. Because of his youth and the fact that few inmates knew him, Gallegos easily passed for an inmate and left the institution with a group who surrendered to authorities. That Sunday morning, inmates were pouring out of the prison, and officials said some 800 prisoners were outside the riot-torn walls. With his escape, 5 hostages remain inside. In anticipation of a news conference at 8:15 a.m. that morning, inmates brought Captain Roybal out of the front entrance and turned him over to Rodriguez and Montoya. 4 hostages remain inside. The release of the ranking hostage officer marked the resumption of the negotiations that had been discontinued 7 hours earlier. Then just a few hours later at 10:55 a.m., Officer Ronnie Martinez escaped out of the rear of the prison with the help of some inmates. Then around an hour later at 11:57 a.m., Officer Ortega was released by inmates. Only 2 hostages remain. 34 hours after the takeover in dormitory E2, inmates got the televised news conference they had been persistently demanding. Just after noon Sunday, Mills and Rick Johnson, a cameraman from Albuquerque, set up an interview with inmate negotiators Lonnie Duran, Vincent Catalari, and Kendrick Duran in the office in the gatehouse. 4 other reporters, Bill Feather, Bruce Campbell, John Gillis, and John Robertson of the Santa Fe New Mexican, were summoned from the front entrance near the highway to take part in the session. The inmates expressed concerns about retaliation after the riot and about housing arrangements. Their remarks indicated that the insurrection was rapidly drawing to a close, and they were told on camera that they would be transferred out of state once the inmates released the last of the hostages. Finally, at 1:26 p.m., the inmates released the last 2 remaining hostages, Officer Gutierrez and Mendoza. At approximately the same time, 50 inmates escaped from the prison, leaving only 75 to 125 inside. The riot was over. By 1:30 p.m. Sunday, February 3, 1980, the violence had spun itself out, at which point police and National Guardsmen retook the penitentiary without resistance. The state then started the process of identifying the dead and the living, providing temporary housing for the inmates, rebuilding the burned-out prison, preparing to prosecute criminal cases, defend against civil suits, and if possible, learn what had gone wrong. And that concludes the 1980 riot at the Penitentiary of New Mexico. Thanks for watching.